I would say the biggest geopolitical threat to Canada is China and the China model. I would say the biggest security threat to Canada is the Iranian regime and the instability they foment through exporting terrorism around the world.
The evidence is increasingly clear. Either intentionally or unintentionally, China has unleashed a deadly disease onto the world, grinding our economies to a halt, leading to unprecedented crackdowns on our rights and freedoms, and forcing Western governments to ratchet up deficit spending to unimaginable highs. Will China face any consequences for its evil actions? What can liberal democracies like Canada do to hold China accountable and make sure they pay for their reckless actions in covering up the coronavirus, lying about the damage it does, and for the global death and destruction they have caused? Meanwhile, it wasn't that long ago that the Islamic Republic of Iran shot down a commercial airliner whose ultimate destination was Canada. How can Iran get away with a murderous act of war? And has the world already forgotten? My guest today on the Candice Malcolm Show's True North Speaker Series is Shuv Majumdar. Shuv is a Munk Senior Fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He served as the policy director for Conservative Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird and worked with Jason Kenney when he was the defense minister. Shuv worked in Iraq and Afghanistan from 2006 to 2010, where he led the efforts of the International Republican Institute. In my conversation with Shuv, we talked about Canada's role in the world, how to deal with our greatest adversaries, namely China and Iran, and also how to properly tackle the pressing issues of our day, including combating terrorism, building a responsible refugee program, integrating newcomers to Canada, and promoting pluralism while not succumbing to leftist multiculturalism. Shuv has a vision for Canada as a conservative superpower, and he wonderfully articulates how conservatives can win the upper hand and push back against the leftist cabal that promotes global citizenship, climate alarmism, and worldwide socialism. Shuv, it's a great pleasure for you to be joining us today, so welcome and thank you for being here.
You missed an important title. I'm also the honorary chairman of the Candice Malcolm for Prime Minister fan club.
Okay. That's very nice of you to say, Shuv. Although I don't know. I don't think that's a job I would want. Seeing how the media treats conservatives and how they like to sort of demonize them, I don't think that's a enviable position to be in. I like being a journalist just fine over here.
You and True North have been such an incredible group of warriors for the cause and for the movement. I'm just so flattered and honored that you would want to spend a bit of time with me today. Thank you for having me.
Well, Shuv, you're really a knowledgeable expert on so many topics. I want to first talk to you about just a general situation we find ourselves in. We're all locked in. We've been inside for weeks and weeks now. We're watching the economy tumble, but sadly, we've also seen thousands of Canadians die from this mysterious virus that originated out of Wuhan, China. So what are your current thoughts? What are your thoughts on the lockdown, on the virus and the government's reaction? Do you think they've done a decent job? Do you think they've gone too far? What do you make of it all?
Well, listen, I mean, hindsight, pardon the pun, will be 2020 on this. I think that the government federally was slow to respond despite the intelligence that they would have had access to. It's been revealed over the last weeks that there was an awareness that this crisis had been brewing in Wuhan, in China, and despite the Chinese cover-up, Canadian officials didn't take the threat as seriously as they could have, and probably deferred too much to international organizations like the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the standards that global bureaucrats had set that forsake the Canadian interests at that time. The lockdown that had ensued had been awkwardly implemented federally. I'm so grateful that we have a federal system of government in Canada that has powerful leaders spanning Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario. You know, our friend Jason Kenney, I think, is probably the model for incisive, smart leadership that actually puts the interests of his constituents, his province, his people first, rather than the priorities of some international group.
Or an ideology. I mean, just sorry to cut you off, but I know please. Kenney implemented enhanced security measures because he knew that Trudeau wasn't doing it at the airport, even though it's federal jurisdiction. You know, he said forget about the ideology here. What's important is keeping Canadians safe from foreign travelers.
Well, that is part of, I think that's the prioritization of his ideological disposition, in that our citizens, our country comes first. And the safety and their security is the primary responsibility of any government. And so I'm glad that he never lost sight of the most important aspect of what his job is, and the responsibility on his shoulders. And I don't think that we saw that at the federal level.
Well, right. And not just with that, Shuv. I mean, sure, China was providing misleading information. The WHO was sort of repeating it. But we even saw the Trudeau government and his top health official, Theresa Tam, sort of almost parroting what seemed to be like Chinese propaganda, saying that there was no human-to-human transmission, that travel bans were ineffectual, that you didn't need to wear a mask. You had Patty Hajdu, the health minister, actually applauding and praising China. And then she doubled down on it a few weeks later. She said that there's no reason not to trust their data, even as China was actively changing its own data and changing the definition of how it calculated coronavirus and infections. And then she said that she had actually been praising China's initial response to the virus. Well, I recall the initial response in China to be a complete cover-up. They were arresting journalists, they were arresting scientists and whistleblowers. People were disappearing. They had locked down travel within their own country, but they didn't lock down international travel. So I just want to transition and ask, how can we hold China accountable? What can be done to push back against China? I mean, I don't count on the Trudeau government to do it, but what can citizens do, and what can the international community do to hold China to account?
Well, listen, that's a huge question, Candice, and I think a lot of what your preamble there was right on point. I mean, China had their senior advisors speaking to President Xi Jinping as early as November last year, already discussing how they could leverage their position on global value chains with respect to medicine and medical supplies as an instrument of economic power. They were effectively weaponizing their medical supply chains to the world, which is not what trusted friends and partners do. What we are seeing today, I think, in the country is because, millions of people are locked down. Our main concern is about the safety and health of our people in public health systems that could be overrun. Every Canadian is directly encountering what happens when a predatory government in a country far away makes decisions to the interest contrary of Canadians. And I think in Canada, we're starting to experience an awakening, tragically, an awakening of the fact that the world is not some sort of kumbaya community of good actors, but that in fact the most belligerent rising economy in the world, that being of the Communist Party of China, is actually acting against our interests and against the values that we hold dear, and the values that have actually seen an unprecedented period of global prosperity. Now, the institutions that China has been manipulating, I think, is one of the first ways to deal with this. President Clinton had invited China to join the World Trade Organization. I myself included have to do a mea culpa. I spent a balance of the 2000s advocating for deeper trade with China, with the hope that, the prosperity of the people, unleashing the entrepreneurial ethic of the Chinese people would also be matched by a demand for more democratic government, the rule of law. We've seen exactly the opposite emerge. And we've seen this pattern building for the last decade and come more acutely into focus 5 years ago with President Xi reading himself into the Chinese constitution as lifetime rule. So what do we do about this? I think, first and foremost, we should be unafraid to talk about China for what it is, rather than what we wish it were. And what that means is that we should be loud and clear that their concentration camps for Uyghur Muslims, some reports up to 2 million people, is certainly not tolerable. We should acknowledge that the basic law that informs a relationship with Hong Kong, which would assure Hong Kong democracy, is something that they have walked away from materially. You can see it manifest in the presence of Chinese police and propaganda in Hong Kong. The people of Hong Kong, a generation who never grew up knowing what it was under the British mandate, are now standing up for the freedoms they were promised. So with China walking away from the basic law that they had agreed to uphold, I think the world should revisit the question of its own relationship with China and with Hong Kong. Similarly with Taiwan in the immediate neighborhood, we have seen a vibrant Chinese democracy in Taiwan be a great international partner, both in the context of the pandemic crisis, but also as a model across Asia for how a democratic country, a true partner of the West, can actually be a real ally and friend. So I think that it's high time that we start moving toward recognizing the great people of Taiwan and their government and inviting them around the table to be productive. More largely, more strategically at a global level, China has been deploying they've developed the China model as an alternative to the Western model. And what we're seeing is the rise of the dragon, so to say, where China has now moved beyond its own domestic development and established through what they've called the Belt and Road Initiative arteries into Asia and Africa. These economic, political, and military arteries are designed to fuel the rise of a China that creates a new model for the world, the China model. And the investments that they make through this BRI in Africa and Asia are principally toward resources and infrastructure to get those resources to China, where China can finish those raw materials and sell them to the West at discounted rates. And second, through data, through platforms, and through surveillance. In Canada, we're struggling with both of those issues, particularly platforms and surveillance, more acutely focused on the question of Huawei, for which I think today, the Canadian cabinet should make the decision that Huawei and China is not acting in the interests of being a good trade partner, but rather to extend their hegemony based on the experience of their global effort. Finally, one of the most important things that Canada can do is revisit the entire trading partnership and the global trading architecture with respect to China. The supply chains that China now occupies strategic positions are ones in which are proving to be deeply unreliable. And while it may come at great cost, what I would propose as an alternative is to deepen partnerships with other countries that have the capacity to replace the China role in the global value chains. And we could talk more about that a little later, but I think there are great opportunities for Canada to think beyond China in terms of where we do trade in Canadian businesses, particularly medium ones, to recruit the kind of capacity they need to engage in the trading agreements that Prime Minister Harper and his government had established around the entire world, some 50 plus agreements in which we have opportunity to build new partnerships.
Well, I think you covered a lot there, and we'll get back to a lot of it. Specifically, we'll talk about 5G a little later on in the interview. But I'm glad you finished on trade, because that was going to be my next question anyway. I know you said that you had you made a mea culpa, or you make a mea culpa about your desire to push for more free trade with China in the last decade. I think at that time the idea was still that millions upon millions of people in China were coming out of poverty for the first time. And I think just from sort of like a human flourishing perspective, obviously it was a noble goal, because so many people who had been living in poverty can now afford, basic things, and people, aren't starving in China like they were a couple decades earlier. So obviously there's some good that has come of it. But, I think we're hitting this new crossroad, even among conservatives, the idea that free trade has always been sort of sacrosanct in the conservative platform and in what conservatives advocate for, sort of libertarian perspective. But I think more and more people are coming out and really questioning whether you can really have free trade with a country that's so authoritarian and communist led, that it's involved in so many aspects of the market. It's not a free market over there. So why do we classify it as free trade in a free market system here? I think there's also a lot of skepticism. We've been seeing a lot of the stuff that's been sent to Canada in terms of PPE, masks, personal protective equipment, that's been contaminated or moldy, or that was supposed to come and didn't. There were those 2 jets that flew over and were supposed to come back with PPE, and they came back empty. So we see repeatedly how China reneges on its responsibility. It's not a transparent actor. So even if free trade over the decades have been good for Chinese people, it's not necessarily good for the Canadian people or the American people. Some of the consequences that have come from that. Did you think there will be a big pushback after the coronavirus to establish a totally new regime with China? I think more people are now seeing more clearly what China is capable and how they operate. Or do you think China will just sort of get away with it all and be in a stronger position after this, given the new, there'll be a new demand for cheap products. China will do just fine with the new low price of oil. Or what do you think is going to happen next, Shuv?
Listen, I think in China, we're seeing an unprecedented amount of propaganda coming from China with language that is frankly beyond irresponsible. And I think many Chinese diplomats around the world, whether it's in Canada or in Sweden or in Australia and New Zealand, where they've been particularly pointed and harsh and rude, I think that what we're seeing there is an attempt by these diplomats to reflect back to Beijing their loyalty. And what it tells me is that President Xi is increasingly paranoid. His economy is in shambles and opaque in terms of being able to measure from the outside any discernible progress. And I think there might be competition within the Chinese Communist Party for power in the aftermath of this crisis, because I think a lot of Chinese companies and individuals, I would say adults, are deeply concerned and worried about the direction of their own government. The thing about President Xi is that he's done a very efficient job at putting all of his opponents into prison. And so there is no immediately apparent rival. Chinese politics is probably divided into 7 or 8 regions. And I could see those regions with their varying levels of competence struggling to try and establish better and trusted trade relationships to fulfill exactly what you've described, the continuity of the connectivity of Chinese economy to global markets. However, more importantly, I think what we are going to see is this idea, and imagine this, Candice, that the idea that putting a national interest first is somehow compromising our greater ideals. Like we forget that the entire post-war order, the United Nations, the military alliances, everything that the G7, everything that market-based democracies had built, the ticket to the party to participate in those institutions was to subscribe to the normative idea of our freedoms. And even China subscribes to the UN Charter. What's happened is that they've made a lie of their commitment, as have autocracies around the world, and manipulated these systems and the best intentions of bureaucrats to leverage toward the success of a limited cabal, and use the resources that trade has created to suppress their people even further, rather than aim to modernize or democratize or establish a more rules-based system in their own economy. So what that might mean is that countries will reassert the idea of a national interest, that they would want to trade with trusted partners that say what they do and abide by the rules. And what I think we are about to start seeing in this global economic reorder is a gated globalization, in which you have economies that have learned and have confidence and to trust each other, starting to organize in their national interests, as they should, more cooperatively, and no longer be deceived by countries as opaque as China and others, and their proposition for partnership. So
that's a really good point, Shuv. I just to cut you off, I want to say that we have seen sort of a resurgence of the kind of I don't know if you want to call it nationalism, or at least looking out for the national best interest, and move away from the sort of global citizen international institutions push just by some basic necessities. You know, everyone had to close their borders. Did you ever think we'd see that happening? A Trudeau government closing Canada's borders. And I think that just to pick up on what you said, that the sort of consensus after the war about all these international institutions was based on some shared values. And I think that idea has slipped away, just given that, China has such an undue influence over a lot of these international institutions, as do other corrupt authoritarian regimes like, Iran or other countries. Do you think that these institutions have been a failure, or do you think that they're going to, like you said, see a reshuffling and a sort of a new way of organizing after this pandemic?
Yeah, I wish it were binary, because I think that in some ways, many of these institutions have been successful for the West Like I had mentioned, I think that we have seen the greatest period of human prosperity ever. And that is because of the rules-based international system that the post-war order had benefited from. What has happened primarily over the 90s and into contemporary times is that they have been seized by socialism, in which the idea of a national interest was diminished for the benefit of a global liberalism. And I don't think that there's anything to be concerned about, because what we're seeing is a failure of the idea that, we're in a borderless world, that, there is no such thing as a bad trade deal. All trade deals are good deals. That communities of people that are flying over, productive states, and the rich are becoming richer, the poor are becoming poorer. The gap between rich and poor is widening, not shrinking, generally globally. What we're seeing is a reassertion of the idea of national interests. We've seen the restoration of borders in the context of crisis, and that is the natural state of things. That is okay in my mind. What I think is important is that we guard against socialist schemes, whether it is collectivist ideas of cooperation globally that redistribute wealth and don't create real enterprise, down to domestic agenda issues where, the income tax is a remnant of the world wars. The erosion of privacy is a remnant of the war on terror. I worry about the kind of guaranteed income that's being supplied for people who are being displaced will be converted into even grander socialist schemes that inhibit the prosperity of our people. So domestically, globally, I do think there will be a reordering around national interests. I think that's not a bad thing. I think there would be more accountability around regimes that don't subscribe to that. And I think we actually have to contend with an era of strategic competition with China and the China model. And that requires even greater cooperation between democracies, not just established ones, but the new and prosperous ones that are emerging around the world.
Yeah, I mean, just you raised some really good points, and I hope we do see a bit of a reordering, because, even just what you said about how socialism has sort of crept over as a priority in a lot of these institutions, it's not like it's painted as socialism. It's always painted as some other issue that just looks a lot like socialism, or the solution always looks like socialism. And you see that as what many on the left and many in these international institutions still believe is the biggest crisis of our time, climate change or global warming. And really kind of some of the things that they're calling for would be a society that looks a lot like what our society under lockdown looks like, where people aren't driving, people aren't flying, we have very restrictive rules and laws, and huge out of control government spending. I mean, they're not out and out calling for socialism, but the solution to the problems that they're identifying look a lot like socialism. I don't really see that going away. How can we combat some of those issues that might on the surface seem like noble, or that people are acting in good faith because of something they believe in, but the solutions that they're pushing for are things that will be entirely disastrous and destructive to our civilization?
I think the left that's a great question. I think the left has really, updated the palatable branding around socialism by calling it social justice, in which groups, whether they be tribes or religions or whatever, but groups, identitarian politics are broken into communities that are bereaved versus celebrating individuals who have inherent worth. So social justice, I think, on the left needs to be contrasted on the right with the idea of social mobility, in which the most disenfranchised in anywhere in the world, and we're talking about almost Depression era levels of joblessness happening across the world as a result of this pandemic. But the solutions need to be about social mobility, and how do you get the most vulnerable empowered by getting access to opportunity, to see that through hard work, through being productive, through contributing to their society through the income taxes that they would eventually pay, that creating that dignity that comes with work gives them an opportunity to move up in the world and to offer their children and their children's children better qualities of life in the long term. So I think that our antidote to social justice should be social mobility. And what that really distills down to is more enterprise, not less, less government, not more. and the reliance that we can perform with the best. We are the 10th largest economy in the world in Canada, and we shouldn't be slaves to the expectations of being a middle power. We should set clear, ambitious objectives of nation building and growing our economy and connecting our people to the best prosperity that they could access in the world.
I really like that. I don't think I've ever heard that juxtaposition before, to compare social justice on the left, which is really it sounds nice on the surface, but as soon as you kind of look into it and break it down, you really start to see how it's designed to pull at the tradition and the underpinnings of our society, pull them apart and pit people against each other for grievances that people didn't even think about a few decades ago.
Yeah, so, exactly.
I think that the Conservatives would be wise to frame it that way and to think about it that way as well. Shuv, you're so knowledgeable about just about every international issue, and so I want to kind of go through a couple of the big sort of international stories and how they affect Canada. So let's start with Iran. 2020 started out with a bang. There's just been so many wild news stories that you kind of forget about the last one because each one is so overwhelming and new. But it wasn't too long ago that President Donald Trump took out a top Iranian organizer of terrorist groups, Qasem Soleimani, in reaction to an Iranian attack at a Iraqi military base that was housing American troops. It sort of turned into a little bit of a hot war for a few weeks there that were pretty alarming, and it culminated with the Iranian regime shooting down a commercial airliner that was just about filled with Canadians, people who are Canadian citizens, permanent residents, students, people coming to visit family in Canada. An absolute horrific act. I thought it was an act of war. I thought that Trudeau let Iran off the hook too easily by calling it a tragedy. Tragedy is something that happens to you. This was something that was done to us by an adversarial state, a malicious one. And then we saw a few weeks later Trudeau meeting with Iranian officials and even bowing to them, which I think really upset a lot of Iranian people in the diaspora community in Canada, Iranian dissidents and human rights activists. So what is the state of Canada's relationship with Iran? Do you think Iran will ever be held accountable for downing that commercial airliner?
The Prime Minister is always seeking to make best friends with the worst actors, whether it's with Beijing or the clerical military dictatorship of Iran. Before the situation got so worse, where you saw these innocent people get murdered by the actions of the Iranian military, the Prime Minister had directed his officials and his cabinet members to try and normalize relations and indeed enhance relations with both of China and now Iran. The truth of the matter is that Iran over the last decade has done a magnificent job at persuading the world that there is the concept of reformers in their cabinet. The fact is that you cannot put your name on a ballot unless the closest leadership to the supreme leader authorizes your name to be on a ballot. That's not freedom. You cannot put your name on a ballot if you're a woman. You cannot put your name on a ballot if you belong to a minority community and are actually representing their interests rather than just being a subservient parrot for the regime to those communities.
Well, and there's hardly any minority communities left in
yes.
Iran. Iran used to be a multicultural society or pluralistic society, and now it's, I think, 99.9% Shia Muslims. So they don't really have any tolerance whatsoever for minorities.
Occupied in the halls of power by a clerical military dictatorship that has acted against the interests of the West, not in favor of it. I don't see that this new envoy that they've dispatched, the former public safety minister, Ralph Goodale, I think he'll be thoughtful about investigating the circumstances of how these people were murdered. And I think that there's a lot of symbolism about that might be important to pursue on a level, but the genuine accountability you seek and the justice that I think these families demand, rightly so, would only come when the clerical military dictatorship is confronted for the evil that it is, for its continued campaign against human rights, against its own people, as you said, draining its country of any diversity, for its sponsorship and export of terror in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, and globally, and for its continued ambitions as a nuclear weapons power, not a nuclear power, but a nuclear weapons power. I mean, just this last week, they launched a rocket that could go up to space. The subtext being that if you can launch a rocket into space, then you can also create intercontinental ballistic missiles. And this is a regime, not a country. This is a regime that is not interested in being a good international partner. They're focused purely on their own survival. They are obsessed with the idea of lifetime rule. And the only thing that would result in something meaningful for the victims of the people on the plane, for their families, for the Iranian people, indeed, is when you see a change in the regime and its behavior and its conduct around the world.
One of the things that the former Harper administration did, Shuv, and I think you're probably involved in this, was they created legislation that would allow Canadians to sue in court regimes that had sponsored terrorism, or to hold groups responsible. And I remember at the time, I think they seized about $10 million of Iran's assets in Canada, so that people who had been families of members whose family members have been killed by Hezbollah or any number of terrorist group that Iran sponsors, they could actually sue them for damages. Is that something that these airline families could potentially do? Is that infrastructure still in place? Are there assets that they could access? Or do you think that the only way to really have any kind of justice or closure for them would be regime change in Iran?
Listen, I think that, yes, you know what, and the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act still exists, and thank God that it does. The assets that the government of Canada seized include a couple of categories. The first are the Iranian government's assets. So irrespective of who's in power, that belongs to the Iranian state. And at one point, Iran will be free of this regime, and those assets belong to the people and the government that they're in. Those are not ones that can be accessed through the Justice of Victims of Terrorism Act. However, there are other assets that were owned by the embassy, which, if they were sold, could produce some modest means of justice for these families. I think that true justice happens when you have a spirit of reconciliation, in the sense that the people who murdered these families' loved ones are tried in court and receive sentencing. We cannot expect that to happen in this regime in Iran. And we cannot expect that this regime in Iran is interested in pursuing genuine reform toward that end. What we can expect is that the longstanding protests of the Iranian people, who are upset and furious with their government for spending scant resources on global adventurism, and their aspirations are ones that ought to be reflected in what happens next. And so I do think that much of what will be essential for victims of the bombing of the rocket attacks on the flights, for victims of Iran's repressive regime inside the country, the only path is regime change. And the fastest way toward it is to continue this campaign of maximum pressure that we've seen implemented from Washington.
I completely agree. And I think just to reiterate that, I mean, they recently had elections about, I think, 2 months ago, and the voter turnout was an all-time low. And this was even before the pandemic. After the airline was shut down, we saw huge protests of Iranian dissidents, especially here in Canada. I went down to one in Mellaswin Square in Toronto, and I just was sort of overwhelmed by all the different groups. Shuv, there's a lot of differences within the Iranian diaspora community. There are people on the left, people on the right, what they're all united by, though, is their hatred of the regime. And to see them all these different groups come together to protest together. One of the things I kept hearing, though, from activists that I spoke to was their deep concern with the Liberal Party, specifically Liberal MP Majid Jawari and his ties, his alleged ties to the Iranian regime. People were telling me, you need to expose this. We need to look into it. There's something not right there between that relationship. What do you think? I know you said that Trudeau came in with this idea of reconciliation and creating new relationships. But do you think it's based on naivety that Trudeau is willing to cozy up with this regime, or do you think there's something darker going on here?
I wish it were naivety. It seems to be a perception of the world that just isn't rooted in reality. Interestingly, Majid Jawahari is also a prominent member of the Canada-China Legislative Association, which defies logic because I can't think of a credible legislature in China. The politics of the prime minister in these really important geographies that decide majority governments or minority governments is to cozy up with people who can bank votes in the most effective way. And we have long known that the Iranian regime has had their agents inside the country. Former National Security Advisor Dick Fadden has been very articulate on this point. I'm saying that because of nonpartisan professionals. It is clear that Iran has a presence in Canadian politics. They know they're trying to, through their proxies, attempt normalization for business regions that benefit the IRGC and not the Iranian people. They are looking for their foils in parliament to lobby for normalization with a regime that is extremist. And they have been very successful at, interfering in our democratic life. I think that, the prime minister and their cabinet have the benefit of the best advice of very talented officials. I'm not somebody who goes off and says that every bureaucrat in the government of Canada is a bad person. They're not. There's some very, very talented people who understand Iran for the threat it is. But when the political level defies the advice of their seasoned officials, then it tells you that there's something much more either ideological or sinister at play. What I can tell you is this: this government has not been acting in the interests of Canada when it comes to Iran.
It's really interesting. I wish that there was the same level of accountability and pushback against this Liberal government, because things like that deserve to be out in the open. They deserve to be aired. And you just know that back when the Harper government was in power, if the Harper minister was deliberately going against the recommendations of bureaucrats, you'd hear about it in the pages of the Globe and Mail or the CBC. Unfortunately, there's just not that much coming out in terms of what's happening behind the scenes. So, hopefully, someone will speak out and talk about it, because I think you're right. There's a lot going on there, and it's not in the best interest of Canadians. Shuv, let's move on. I want to talk about India, because I know you spend a lot of time in India, and I want to specifically talk about Indian Prime Minister Modi's. He introduced a new citizenship law aimed at helping refugees from neighboring countries sort of get fast-tracked citizens. So these refugees who were members of persecuted religious minorities living in countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, they're offered almost immediate citizenship when they get to India. But this law became controversial because it focused on religious minorities. So people who were Christian or Hindu or Buddhist or Sikh, or even smaller religions like Parsis and members of the Jain religion, who were being persecuted by the Islamist governments in those neighboring countries. But it didn't include Muslims from other countries. So the law is specifically for religious minorities and not Muslims. I mean, that's controversial. I could never see something like that happening in Canada. But at the same time, part of the big problem with the refugee crisis a couple of years ago was that we didn't really know who was a refugee and who wasn't, because everyone was saying that they were a refugee. Refugee used to have a very specific meaning, and it kind of doesn't anymore. It's sort of anyone who's a migrant who wants a better life. What do you think of Modi's new law? And do you think it's a good step, or do you think it's a mistake?
First of all, let me congratulate you on your thought leadership on the space of refugee policy. You are actually at that intersection where identitarian warriors, socialists, collectivists, conflate the legitimate questions around citizenship, the rule of law, the concept of the individual with identitarian politics, and you have the battle scars to prove it. So let me start with that compliment, because that is exactly the kind of issues that India has been wrestling with. We're talking about, I lament because we often talk about these crises, these issues on the terms of somebody else's frame rather than our own. And so if I might, I think India is not a story that started in 2019. It's a story that started 3,000 years ago, which were the origins of the Hindu society that has informed so much of the vast Indo-Pacific region and is the underpinning behind, civilizational life for billions of people in India and beyond. Contemporary India, is a product of current colonial legacies. One would have been India in the Persianate age, in which Islam had powerful influences on Indian politics and organization. And Indian Hinduism informed much of that as well. That intersection between Persia and old Hindu and Indian identity is actually in Afghanistan. It's a fascinating place to see that intermix. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, current contemporary colonial issues and pressures are from the British Raj, the British colonial period. Why do I start with that? I start with that because these issues that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been dealing with after he expanded his majority mandate last year are all part of an important narrative about the Indian state overcoming its colonial heritage. The first would have been Article 170 and the reassertion of Indian sovereignty in Kashmir. The second is the NRC, the head count essentially, that is largely dealing with the pressures of the 1971 partition of East Pakistan, which was bloody and horrific because you had Pakistani military acting in a sectarian fashion against the Hindu populations of Bangladesh that migrated into India informally. And then the Citizenship Amendment Act, which is what we're talking about now, which is documenting this legacy of refugees. You can imagine in the last some 50 years of Indian independence, these issues of religious and ethnic identity woven into the colonial history. They were violent issues. India's had mass-scale pogroms over the last 40 years between religious communities and grievances that were unresolved because of generally weak Indian institutions and a fair bit of corruption. It is a democracy it's a bit of a miracle that it continues to be a democracy. So what I see in what Prime Minister Modi is doing is reconciling these legacy issues so that Indians can be documented for their identity as citizens. And that means that they can then access the benefits of participating as citizens, whether it's the education system, the social welfare system, the economic opportunity of a rising India and its importance for the world in the age to come. These are all essential issues that, if they were unresolved, would continue to tie India to its colonial legacy rather than its democratic future. So I support this in a big way because I think that most of the coverage on these issues is an alignment between socialists and leftists in international press that don't want to see India succeed, that inaccurately portray Narendra Modi as some sort of ideological Hindu fundamentalist. And there are huge gaps in facts and analysis that we all have to overcome when thinking about the Indian opportunity.
You raised some really good points. I think a dead giveaway for me when I'm reading an article, because I like to go out and read whatever the the New York Times or Washington Post or the Globe and Mail or Toronto Star is saying, just to try to understand the arguments they're making. And a dead giveaway is when they describe a government not as an Islamist force, but as just a Muslim majority country, making it seem, they did this with Trump and his travel bans. What they do is they make it seem like the government hasn't done anything wrong. The only fault that's being looked at is the fact that the society happens to be majority Muslim, even though that's completely irrelevant to the classification. Trump's travel ban was designated towards countries that were sponsoring terrorism or were aiding and abetting terrorist groups. This law, which again it was described, by the New York Times as saying, it specifically targets Muslim majority countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, completely glossing over the idea that these societies, it's not just that they're Muslim majority, it's that they're run by Islamists in accordance with the most draconian types of Sharia law, which mean that, ethnic minorities, religious minorities are just by virtue of that persecuted, all these kinds of blasphemy laws that unfairly target Christians and other groups. So I think we should definitely be wary of that. You mentioned the pogrom pogroms had happened in India. And I think one of the ones that we hear a lot about, because Canada has such a large Sikh population. And we heard about this a lot when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was in India a few years ago, embarrassing himself on the world stage by dressing up and dancing. And it turns out that he had an extremist as part of his own entourage over in India. But there's a group of people, I think pretty much makes up a small minority of Sikhs in Canada, but they're part of an organization that want to carve a Sikh ethno-state out of India called Khalistani. And I know that this caused a lot of embarrassment for Trudeau, because he had one of these Khalistani extremists on his trip with him. But what I learned a lot through that and through sort of investigating afterwards was the presence of Khalistani extremists in Canada. They have a pretty large presence. You see their flags at parades. You see their presence. And even just online, when I was reporting on it, I would get just a barrage of hatred from these activists who are so brazen.
Death threats. They threaten your life and your family.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's crazy and bizarre. And, the only Canadian journalist to ever be assassinated was at the hands of this group back in I think it was the 1980s. Yes. So I mean, this is a group that in some ways they're completely irrelevant because they're small and a minority, and most people disregard them. But they're also, I mean, I don't know how large they are, what percentage of the Sikh community in Canada, but they definitely seem vocal and adamant and aggressive in my interactions with them. So do you consider this Khalistani extremism or radicals or terrorists, whatever you want to call them, do you consider them a threat to public safety here in Canada?
I think they threaten not just one democracy, but two. I think that, outside of India, the extremism that this ethnic and religious chauvinism represents has been prospering in Canada disproportionately, perhaps in the UK second, and then in the United States. These are the children of people who fled a horrible period of time in the early 80s in India. And what's interesting to me is that their organization is what their organization does not pronounce on. They only have a singular obsession about the treatment of Sikhs in India, which in the 80s was a horrible period for them, as it was for Hindus and Christians and almost every religious denomination in the country. And they are right to seek justice, justice which had been slow to come until, incidentally, Narendra Modi came into power and actually moved forward convictions and reparations in ways that were meaningful to a healing in India that has happened and not anywhere else. What is troubling is that they do not pronounce on the draining of Sikhs from Pakistan's Punjab. They do not pronounce on, I visited the Gurdwara in Kabul back when I used to live in Afghanistan. They do not pronounce on the draining of Afghan Sikhs. They talk about the plight that these individuals are encountering, but for some logic-defying act, they go and pronounce on India as being the source of this. Why is that? I would argue that, in Canada, you have the political hustlers and thugs who, with money and propaganda, have persuaded an entire community to feel that they are amongst the most persecuted in the world. Now, I'm not one to speak about their experience of persecution. I think that some of that is legitimate, but I don't think that the way in which they're channeling that anger toward a Khalistan state that defies any democratic or economic logic is an appropriate or responsible use of the pain and suffering that people feel. I think that if these communities were genuinely interested in reconciliation and in helping deepen the integration that Sikhs contribute to Canadian life, because there are many successful Sikhs who do that, they should be focused more on a journey of understanding the history of where this came from and looking at it for the big picture context that it has across the subcontinent. And we're not seeing any of that happen with this community. Instead, we're seeing political hustlers and thugs politicize this, vote bank people in local elections, go after anybody who threatens the idea that the source of this fear and grievance they draw on, go after anybody with absolute ruthless and rude and violent intentions. And again, they only start the story at the 1980s in the storming of the Golden Temple. but they don't talk about the full picture and the bigger story that these communities have had to wrestle with, which is frankly irresponsible.
Well, it's really interesting, Shuv, because when you look at the Sikh diaspora in Canada, I mean, they're incredibly successful. We're talking about highly educated, very intelligent people who have done very well and built a great life for the next generation. So it almost just seems like something's off in their grievance and why they're so worked up about this issue that seems so relevant here in Canada. One of the things that I found just through talking to people in India during this whole escalation around the Khalistani extremism was that the issue, from my understanding, the issue in Punjab in India is almost dead and gone. Like it's an idea of the past. And the people who left India at that time in the 80s held on to that idea. They brought it to Canada. And in some ways that idea has been able to prosper and grow, and it was fostered in Canada. Whereas, if they go back and talk to their family members who stayed in India, they don't have those same grievances. They've moved on, they've moved past it, and they've learned to get along with their neighbors, and they're happy in India. So there's almost this disconnect between the diaspora community here and the Sikh community over there. And then again, just, the use of violence and propaganda. There's a Khalistani rapper, musician out in Surrey, British Columbia, and his music videos are just wildly violent and using historic footage and panning to modern day pictures with all these, restricted guns, and they're wearing Vancouver Canuck jerseys and waving Khalistani flags. It's almost like unbelievable that this is happening in our own backyards. What do you think do you think that the Trudeau government has culpability? Because I know that they've been really working with people who are sort of leading members of this movement for Khalistani independence, and even opening up their party to some of these people. That's the accusation I kept hearing about back when I was covering this issue. That again, just like with the Iranians, that the Liberals are more than happy to appease a group, even though it's not really in the best interest of Canadians.
Canadian communities are under attack by autocratic governments around the world, and they're under attack through information and through exploiting old grievances. We see it with the governments of China that have tried to set up cultural councils to affect and impose their authority into the lives of Chinese Canadians. We've seen it with the Iranian community. We've discussed how the regime deploys agents and money into Canada to try and affect our outcome. And they also leverage risks and threats against Iranian families in Iran, Iranian Canadian families in Iran. The same is true for Pakistan's sophisticated information campaigns inside Canada, particularly with these communities in Vancouver and in Toronto. The government, the political leadership of the country has to come to a consensus that it will not pander to these foreign elements, that it will not allow these foreign elements to subvert our democratic life. But what we've seen from two major Canadian political parties, the NDP and the Liberal Party, is that they are more than happy to make the short-term deal with these vote bank communities because they're more organized, they're more aggressive, they're very communicative than the vast majority of Canadians who want nothing to do with this and would rather just, get on with their lives and be productive and successful. I think that, this government has done some very deeply troubling things. I mean, we forget that the Air Canada, their India bombing was the largest terrorist attack in North America prior to 9/11. But only 2 years ago, the same public safety minister that's now responsible for investigating the crimes in Iran, the murders in Iran, was responsible for deleting the idea of Khalistan from national security documents, using his political pen to delete the actual advice of national security professionals, and deploying, I think, these types of tactics into the civil service, into the bureaucracy, into our security agencies is one of the most dangerous and indictable things that Prime Minister Trudeau and his government has allowed to happen.
Well, they bowed to political pressure there, Shuv, because originally it did say Khalistani extremism was a threat in that national security briefing, and then after some pushback, again from the same well-organized vote banks, they cowered and they removed that because somehow It's a similar tactic to what China is doing now, that they say if you talk about Khalistani extremism, you're being racist towards Sikhs, which sort of defies logic, because Khalistanis are a small radical group within Sikhs. So it's not like you're saying Sikh terrorism. You're actually being very specific about the subgroup and the ideology. But even using that, the liberals cowered to that and just about immediately removed that reference. I remember that.
Well, this is the problem of the social justice that we described in the past, because this is what happens when you threaten the substantive idea of a foreign-supported terrorist organization and network that is trying to undermine not just one democracy but two. Then you get decried to be a racist. When you attack the Chinese Communist Party for covering up the Wuhan virus and acting belligerently on the world stage, then you get attacked for being a racist. When you go after the Iranian clerical military dictatorship regime, then you get attacked for being a racist. When everything's racism, nothing's racism. But also, this is the actual tool in the toolkit of social identitarians, collectivists, tyrants, and they get a lot of airplay with their allies in the mainstream press.
Absolutely. Well, it's a very good point, Shuv. We have some questions that come from our club members. So over at True North, if you want to be able to ask questions during these interviews, all you have to do is join one of our clubs, and then you can go ahead and submit a question at a future interview. So we've got a couple to go through, and the first one is related exactly to what we're talking about. A few weeks ago, we saw the CBC released a news report attacking the Epoch Times for a cover story that they did looking into the Chinese Communist Party's cover-up of the Wuhan coronavirus. How do we find ourselves in a place where the CBC is repeating Chinese propaganda by attacking a newspaper run by Chinese dissidents and Chinese religious minorities? CBC is calling them racist. How do we get to that point, Shuv? And is this just an example of the Canadian institutions being corrupted by foreign powers?
They had 3 journalists from the state broadcaster go after a community and a community news outlet that aspires to do some factual reporting and does a pretty good job of it for what it's worth. And they had this offered up news story with the right kind of, quotes from individual people that, I don't know how Kelowna had so much activity in the last, decade or so in terms of national life, but it is deeply distressing that the state broadcaster would go and do something like this. I think it was today that they provided a correction that this is something that should not have happened, but the damage had already been done. And for propaganda purposes, the Chinese state and the Communist Party now has what they need to go after the Epoch Times and the journalists in those ranks, right? So it's obviously a corrosion and a corruption of how the state broadcaster does its editorial coverage. And it's something that has to be corrected because it's denying our country the kind of debate it deserves.
Absolutely. It's so embarrassing, not just for the CBC, but for all Canadians that this is what we get from our state broadcast. Okay, the next question comes from Jim and Dawn. They say, I wonder if Shuv could share his opinion on the 5G security issues and how it will impact our relationship with the United States. So I think that's referring to the Ming extradition and the greater question of Huawei operating here.
By jailing Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, the Chinese Communist Party and state confirmed that Huawei is a state corporation. Even if it pretends to be a private corp, it is a state corporation. Huawei has established surveillance relationships across Africa and Asia with authoritarian regimes. It is not interested in providing fast data for Canadians. It is interested in gaining a strategic part of the Canadian economy. And with all the products that come with the Internet of Things, like beyond your cell phone, your refrigerator, your toaster, your car, everything is Internet connected. So the 5G technology is really important to our economic development, and the Chinese are not interested in using that as a trusted partner of Canada, but rather to try and find ways to control Canada. The decision before the Canadian cabinet on 5G has been just hanging there for months and months and months, despite the facts for why they should reject it. Even yesterday, we saw that the United States had indicated that they're going to have to consider how to downgrade their intelligence partnership with the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom is trying to embrace a partnership with 5G. I think that, if the Canadian cabinet wanted to make a decision to reject 5G, they could do so today. I think they should do so today. And I don't think that they should allow the Chinese Communist Party to string Canada around by the nose by abusing our justified outrage over the detention of our two Canadians.
It's just wild that these Canadians have been held for so long, Shuv, and it doesn't feel like the government's doing enough to help them. I mean, I don't really know what else they could do aside from halting trade or demanding that the United States jump in to help. But pretty sad to see that situation with two Canadians that, by best accounts, haven't done anything wrong, are being held in horrific conditions where there are reports of just horrible mistreatment, including keeping lights on all night, taking away glasses so that they can't read. I mean, it's just horrific that's happening, and it's such a disgrace for the Trudeau government. Next question. This is from Bill. He asks, what does Shuv consider to be the biggest foreign threat to Canada? Is it China? Is it Russia? Maybe Iran, North Korea, or Venezuela?
Great questions. Well, Russia basically is China's gas station, so we can clump those together. I would say the biggest geopolitical threat to Canada is China and the China model. I would say the biggest security threat to Canada is the Iranian regime and the instability they foment through exporting terrorism around the world. Issues like North Korea and Venezuela are ones that you see the confluence of sometimes all three, Russia, Iran, and China, and our proxy issues that ultimately come from China and then from Iran.
And it's interesting just to note the difference in warfare over the decades. We used to be worried of an actual bombing threat from our adversaries, and now, especially when it comes to China and Iran, it's more a threat of people within our own country who have split loyalties or are loyal to a foreign regime that are here trying to subvert Canadian institutions to benefit another country and a government that's just playing along and not doing anything to stop them, Shuv. It's a different kind of threat than what we've seen in the past, and I don't know that we're equipped as a society to deal with the ramifications of that fact. What do you think?
Well, look, conservatives Canadians are right to be deeply concerned about the presence of foreign regimes in Canada. What I would caution against is to say that somehow having less of a presence of a diverse Canada is the response to that, because the asymmetric threat that you've described is largely created because of technology. Our world is closer and woven more closely together because of technology. Where before, we could count on the Arctic and the United States, the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans to distance ourselves from odious regimes. That no longer works because the threat comes through the internet, or it comes through information on the internet. Or it comes through, things that are not necessarily confronted by militaries, but by the strength of our own society. And so what I would encourage Canadians to really think about is, how do we really continue the success of Canada as a country on the basis of our values, of the equality of every citizen, of the fact that we can all be productive and meaningfully contributing to our rise as a country. Rather than fall into the traps of cultural warfare and identitarian politics.
That's a really good point. One of the things that sometimes I get stuck with is that, I have friends who are from so many of these diaspora communities, and, they're the largest, the most vocal opponents to, the Chinese regime. People from Hong Kong or people from Taiwan who are here in Canada are the most articulate, most vocal critics. Same with, Iranians and many other countries. But often, if I try to jump in and critique those groups, I get thrown with accusations of sowing, racial animosity or being racist. And, it's interesting how, people are almost silenced and threatened if they do speak out about some of these threats. And even again, if you're not criticizing the people, not quite the opposite. You're criticizing the regime that oppresses those people, and I feel like they really use identity politics, like you said, and this sort of culture war to try to silence opposition, which is really damaging to our democracy.
100%. That's why you and True North and the rest of us in support of your cause need to make sure we fight for the culture that made Canada work, which is that of a free, democratic, rule of law society.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on. We've got two more questions here, Shuv. This one comes from Karen. She says, Justin Trudeau has embarrassed us on so many occasions on the world stage, whether it was in India or now his constant need to appease and impress the United Nations. What do you think is the biggest failure of the Trudeau government? And I'll add my own follow-up. Why is Trudeau so obsessed with getting a seat on the United Nations Security Council? And do you think that will actually do anything for Canada if he's successful?
The kind of resources that this government has committed as a project to attain a seat at the Security Council has yet to be revealed. Like, we don't know how much money has gone into authoritarian governments around the world. We don't know what kind of deals have been made. And we are unlikely to see that until they are all announced over the course of several years. Like, there's no obligation for them to produce a balance sheet to Canadians saying, here's how much we've spent. Here's the deals that we made. Here are the values that we sold out on key votes or key opportunities to advocate for people when it mattered. As a singular obsession of the entire government, I think it has completely wasted the necessary work that Canada should have been doing to safeguard our interests, our security interests, our prosperity interests, our values around the world, because you cannot have a seat at the Security Council and be principled at the same time. As a project and an obsession, I think it has been a complete waste of time because it will not result in any meaningful influence anywhere. Now, in terms of what the success is of what have they actually accomplished, I know there is a tendency to say that the USMCA and the update to trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico is an accomplishment. I don't see how it was an accomplishment when what happened, in fact, was that the Americans and the Mexicans made a deal and then put the gun to Canada's head to come on board or be left out into the wilderness. Like, think about it. Donald Trump's America made a deal with his, rival Mexico before their partner and ally in Canada. That's how badly I think the federal government screwed up that negotiation. So I have a very difficult time at pointing to anything that I would characterize as a success.
Well, what do you think has been his biggest failure or an embarrassment on the world stage?
Today, I think it is to have not seen China for the threat it is, and even stubbornly refuse to admit that Canada's interests, Canadians are best benefited by understanding that the world is made worse by the Communist Party of China, and that we need to partner with our democratic friends and allies. I think his failure to understand that is coming at great cost for our country's potential.
That's a really interesting point. Okay, our final question, Shuv, it comes from the staff here at True North. So, Shuv, we know that you work for the non-partisan Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and so we're not talking about big C conservative. We're talking about the concept of being a small c conservative. So what does it mean to be a conservative in 2020? And how can conservatives paint a picture of our worldview that is more appealing to more Canadians?
I appreciate that question a great deal. And I'm fascinated that anybody would want to know my views on this. So thank you for the opportunity. I think first and foremost, to answer social justice with social mobility. I think we as conservatives in Canada have the opportunity to be the model for the world, because we have been the model for the world, and to really reconnect with that idea and reapply it to contemporary times. The second is, I think in this country, we have an opportunity now to reimagine Canada beyond the low expectations of middle power. I think that we should be setting forth the projects of true nation building on the basis of outcomes, not on the basis of nice metrics. Meaning, how do we as a country focus on doubling our economy? And if that is an objective of our country, to be engaged in the world and successful as such, and to offer our model for others to participate with. What does that mean for how we conceive of our security interests in the world? What does that mean for how we pursue partnerships on the basis of our values for cooperation in the world? I think that idea of what we expect Canada to be beyond the middle power is probably one of the more interesting projects that Conservatives could undertake. So I'll leave it at that. But I think that those could be some interesting contributions for conservatism in our country.
I think Conservatives would be wise to pick up on those themes and topics. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Shuv. I know we took up a bunch of your time today, but I think the conversation has been really helpful, really interesting. So thank you for shedding light on some of the world's most complicated issues and most complicated issues of our time. We really appreciate it, and we hope to do another interview with you again, hopefully in person once this whole lockdown thing is over and we get some of our freedoms back.
I can't wait. Thank you for everything you do, your staff, your colleagues. I'm a big fan and will continue to be in the important fights we have ahead. Thank you.
Great. All right. Great. Thank you, Shuv.